Okay, kids, this is Module 20. This is putting it all together and then what can we do about it in terms of aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and maybe a possible problem. So, big question, should we let the economy self-correct or should we do something about it? That picture right there is John Maynard Keynes, and Keynes was of the idea that maybe we could do something about it. Maybe government could help. And um, you know, once his policies were enacted, basically after World War II, right? They tried to do some things during the Depression, but World War II really proved it to be true. Once that happened, we haven't had a great depression since. So maybe stabilization policies have worked according to that. And yes, there are some issues, but we'll talk about those a little bit later. So, what can we do? First of all, we can use fiscal policy, right? The policies of government taxation and spending to be able to influence the economy. What we can do is we can stop recessionary inflationary gaps or for sure try to smooth them out, right? When you think about a gap in the economy, right? If we're talking about the business cycle and I'm looking at, hey, here's potential GDP and I'm looking at the business cycle and what's actually happening, right? If I have these big wild swings, that's bad for sure. So maybe, so if I'm talking about this is like GDP and this is time right here of the business cycle, what if we could just reduce it, right? Like what if you could say, instead of having the highs so high and the lows so low, what if we could just kind of make it swing like up a little bit, down a little bit, up a little bit, down a little bit? Wouldn't that be better to be closer to our potential GDP? That is what we're going to try to do. So when you think about, what's actually happening, here's, actual GDP, that's like mission accomplished. So what can the government do? Well, the government could do some things in terms of fiscal policy, and the government does spend money, right? The government is G. So when you think about transferring money or shifting money around, the government certainly can do that. So let's say we're in some sort of demand shock situation, right? We're going through one of these periods here in our business cycle where we're real low. What we could do over here now, if I have my aggregate supply, aggregate demand, I have my long run aggregate supply of where we should be, right? Long run aggregate supply is my potential, right? That should be like right on these dots here. If my aggregate demand shifted to the left, right? I saw something like that occur. My price level over here is at P1. Now it's at P2. And my overall GDP is less, right? I see like my full employment is now, I have more unemployment than I would really like. So I'm in this problem. So what could the government do about it? Well, maybe if I'm in this negative shock area, right, what I could do is I could do something in the government to try to push this back. Remember, if I do nothing, what's going to happen is we're going to go from this point here over to here, right, because the AD2 happened, right? So here's AD2. And then eventually what's going to happen is people are going to accept lower wages, and then we're going to end up over time hiring more people, and we'll end up down here, right? That's what will happen eventually. But what if I don't have to do that? What if instead of waiting 10 years, I could go to Congress and I could say, hey, Congress, we need a spending bill. Okay, Congress goes out, spends some money. That money, when it's kicked into the economy, turns into even more money because of the multiplier. And now all of a sudden, people start spending again. I might be able to reverse this situation through a spending bill in Congress. And that is the idea behind using like fiscal policy to be able to smooth out some of those wild swings one way or another. Okay. Now, what if I'm in the opposite? I have something like a positive demand shock going on. So over here, right, I have the opposite thing. I got my aggregate supply, I got my aggregate demand, I have my long run aggregate supply, and that's telling me my full potential here. I got my price level over here. And now, something happened, positive demand shock. I'm looking at something like this. Okay, so I got AD2 going on. What is happening here? I got more people employed, yes, but I'm a little worried about my inflation. So I have a kind of a hot economy right now. It's like too much is going on. Maybe it's not good enough, or not good enough, but maybe it's too good, right? I got hardly any unemployed people, and prices are starting to go up real fast. I'm worried about some hyperinflation, something along that line. If I wait, what eventually will happen will be people will go ask for wages. There's not enough people or good employees, so you're going to give some people wages. Eventually, this aggregate supply will shift back over to the left, and I end up here on my long run aggregate supply curve. Okay. If that happens, great, but it's going to take a while for that to occur. What if I said, hey, you know what I can do? I could do something like raise taxes. Okay. So you pass a bill that raises people's taxes. Well, no one's going to like that, right? And when you raise taxes, people spend less. That's part of the problem with raising taxes. But right now in our economy, that's exactly what we want. We want people to spend less, so the prices come back down. So sure enough, I could push AD back to P1, and my hyperinflation is covered. So as I look at something like that, I'm going from this positive shock, right? Doing something to the economy through fiscal policy, taxation in this case, and I'm bringing it back down to where it should be. The question is, should policymakers do something to shorten the period? Should we make or lessen the blow, if you will? And the answer is yes, they should. We don't want a depression. I mean, depressions are obviously awful. If we could shorten the amount of time period that people don't have a good economy, we should do that. And that's part of what fiscal policy does. So here are your graphs again. Expansionary fiscal policy. What can you do to do that? Well, number one, I used the example of increased government purchases, but you could do something like decrease people's taxes. If I decrease people's taxes, they got more money in their pocket. What's going to happen? Yeah, we're going to see more people spending money, which is going to push AD out to the right, shorten that lag, or that negative, right? It's going to make that less time. What could I do? I could increase government transfers. I could move more money into things like Social Security payments. And then those people, they're going to spend more money too. And that'll push AD to the right. On the flip side, contractionary fiscal policy. If my economy is too good and I'm worried about inflation, I could do just the opposite of what I said. I could, first of all, I used I used increase in taxes. But you could do the opposite of decrease government purchases. Be like, hey, you know what? That program we had, yeah, that program's gone. Like, we're not going to buy anything now. We're going to decrease that. It was going to push this back to the left. We could decrease government transfers. You could give people less Social Security payments. And then, oh yeah, you know what? Those prices are going to come down. So fiscal policy, you can use that. Depends on, what you need done to your economy. It works. Now, hard part here is supply shocks, right? Because here, if you notice, moving demand around is pretty easy to do, in all honesty. Give some people money, they're going to spend it. But what about a supply shock if all of a sudden people aren't supplying, right? Supply moves to the left. There's something like our oil problem that we had before, and we see something like that going on over there where the prices are going up and there's not much employment, and all of a sudden we're in stagflation. It is hard to get businesses to supply more. Like, you can do a whole bunch of things to try, but most of them fail. For example, the big one that we try is we always cut business taxes because we're like, oh yeah, because now the businesses are just going to randomly supply more at a cheaper price. No, businesses take that money for profit and then don't supply anything and just take more money for themselves. Like, they're not stupid, right? And then what happens? You end up in a worse situation because now you don't have any tax money and they're still not producing anything. Trying to move supply is very, very difficult. And oftentimes, I get impossible. Let's put it that way. Nobody's ever really done it in a way where it's been like really proven to work. The last thing here, when you're talking about like government spending, just remember, government is part of GDP, right? Every time that we had these labels down here, we should label this, GDP for ourselves. And remember, government is part of that line. So because of that, government spending or government taxation, that's going to do some things to move it around. And the effects of taxes and transfers is going to change how much money that you spend as a consumer. So between the government spending or encouraging your spending, giving you money to spend, that most certainly is going to move that demand curve around. And can we do things to have business investment too to make these aggregate demand move? Sure we can. Supply moves, that's a little more difficult, but demand moves, we can definitely do some things. Now, the problem with using fiscal policy, I mean, there are problems for sure. One of them is going to be a time lag because you have to use Congress. And we know Congress doesn't do anything in an efficient manner anymore. I mean, maybe back in the day, but now there's so much gridlock that it becomes very difficult to pass things. And remember, you got to recognize there's a problem, number one. Then you have to go to Congress and decide to make a decision. Then you have to implement it through Congress. Sometimes by the time that you make a decision, right? Like let's say here, you saw the recession was happening, right? And you're like, hey, we see this little bit of a recession. We see this dip in the business cycle. We got to do something. Okay, by the time you recognize it, do something, etc., it's quite possible the economy has somehow managed to right itself. And now you're doing a whole bunch of policies that were trying to kick AD to the right. And it turns out all you're doing is causing the inflation problem over here. So be careful with the fiscal policy. We're going to talk about some monetary policy, a little easier, a little quicker to do, but that's another day. So see you next time.